April 17, 1975. For the citizens of Phnom Penh, it was the day of peace. After 5 years of a brutal, grinding civil war that had ravaged the countryside and swelled the capital's population to a bursting point of 2 million souls, the fighting was finally over. The American-backed government of Lon Nol had collapsed. The victorious guerrilla army, the Khmer Rouge, was entering the city. To the people lining the streets, these soldiers were liberators. They were sons, brothers, and fathers, fellow Khmers who would bring an end to the corruption and the ceaseless American bombing campaigns. They waved white flags, a symbol of surrender and purity, believing they were welcoming an end to their suffering. But the liberators did not smile back. They did not wave. The army that rolled into Phnom Penh was a phantom force, an army of children with old eyes. They moved with a chilling discipline, their faces grim, impassive. When the crowds offered them food and water, they refused. When the people cheered, they responded by firing their rifles into the air, not in celebration, but as a terrifying assertion of power. The joy on the streets curdled into confusion and then into a cold, creeping dread. Something was terribly wrong. Within hours, the decree came. It spread through the city, shouted from bullhorns and delivered by the cold-eyed teenage soldiers. The Americans are about to bomb the city. You must leave immediately. For your own safety, leave everything. You will only be gone for 3 days. It was the first great lie of the new regime. There was no impending American bombing raid. The danger to the people of Phnom Penh was not from the sky. It was standing right in front of them. What followed was one of the most bizarre and brutal events of the 20th century. The complete, forced evacuation of a major capital city. 2 million people were driven out of their homes at gunpoint. No exceptions. The sick, the elderly, the disabled, women in the midst of childbirth, all were forced onto the roads under the searing April sun. The soldiers offered no help, no water, no compassion. They were merely human sheepdogs, herding a terrified flock towards a destination unknown. Anyone who refused or who could not keep up was shot without ceremony. The 3-day evacuation stretched into a death march that, for tens of thousands, would never end. And behind them, Phnom Penh's soul was ripped out, leaving a concrete skeleton. In just 72 hours, a bustling metropolis was rendered silent, an urban tombstone. The few foreign diplomats and journalists trapped in their embassies watched in horror, describing the eerie silence as a physical presence, a sound that pressed in on them, more deafening than any explosion. When they asked the young soldiers who had ordered this madness, they received the same chilling 3-word answer: Angkar Lu Padavit. The organization is the revolution. Angkar, the organization. It was a name with no face, a power with no personality, a faceless, omnipotent, and unquestionable authority. This was not a military takeover. It was a conquest of reality itself, a declaration of war on a city, on modernity, on knowledge, on family, on history itself. This was day one of an experiment in total social engineering. This was day one of year zero. The question the world would later ask was not just how this could happen, but what kind of twisted ideology, born in the mind of what kind of man, could possibly conceive of it? To understand the faceless organization, we must unmask the man who was its face, its heart, and its architect of terror. A man who would meticulously conceal his own identity from his people for years. Even after taking power, a man the world would come to know by a single, terrifying name, Pol Pot. But he was not born Pol Pot. He was born Saloth Sar in 1925, into a world far removed from the revolutionary violence he would later unleash. His family was not the oppressed peasantry he would claim to champion. They were prosperous farmers with connections to the royal court. His sister was a royal consort, and his brother was an official in the palace. As a boy, Sar spent time in a Buddhist monastery, absorbing the teachings of peace and mindfulness, and later attended elite French language schools in Phnom Penh. By all accounts, he was a gentle, unassuming, and mediocre student. There was nothing to suggest the monster he would become. The crucible that would forge that monster lay half a world away. In 1949, Saloth Sar won a government scholarship to study radio electronics in Paris. He arrived in a city that was the global epicenter of radical thought. The air was thick with anti-colonialism, existentialism, and, most potently, Marxism, for a young man from a small, colonized nation. It was intoxicating. He neglected his technical studies, instead immersing himself in this new world of ideology. He joined the French Communist Party, a party that still revered Joseph Stalin as a heroic figure, a man who had industrialized a nation through iron will and absolute control. He fell in with a small, secret circle of radical Cambodian students, including future Khmer Rouge leaders like Yang Seri and Khieu Samphan. Together, in cramped prison apartments, they read Marx, they debated Lenin, and they planned the future of their homeland. In those rooms, they brewed a unique, virulent strain of communism. From Stalin, they took the concept of the all-powerful state and the necessity of political purges. From Mao, they adopted the idea that a nation's true revolutionary power lay not in city workers, but in the rural peasantry of pure, uncorrupted force. And to this, they added their own venomous ingredient, a paranoid, ultra-nationalism that saw all foreign influence as a cancer, and all cities as the source of that cancer. They came to believe that Cambodia's society, with its Buddhism, its monarchy, and its French-influenced urban culture was fundamentally rotten. It needed to be not just reformed, but completely demolished, wiped clean. They dreamed of an agrarian utopia, a racially pure Khmer state unsullied by money, markets, or intellectuals. It was in the cafes of Paris that the seeds of the killing fields were sown. A fantasy of purification conceived by privileged men who had grown to despise their own. Privilege, after failing his exams for 3 consecutive years, Sar's scholarship was revoked. He returned to Cambodia in 1953 and became a history and geography teacher at a private school. By day, he was brother number 1 in the nascent communist underground. His quiet demeanor was a perfect cover. He was patient, methodical, and an expert at recruiting and organizing. For years, he and his comrades operated in the shadows, slowly building their revolutionary network. In the early 1960s, facing suppression from the government, they fled to the jungles, establishing the army that would become the Khmer Rouge. Rouge. There, in the wilderness, their prison theories hardened into brutal practice, but their greatest recruiting tool would not come from their own efforts. It would be delivered from 30,000 feet in the air by the United States of America. From 1969 to 1973, in a secret and illegal expansion of the Vietnam War, President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, ordered a massive bombing campaign against neutral Cambodia, codenamed Operation Menu. Its goal was to destroy Vietnamese communist sanctuaries. The result was the slaughter of an estimated 150,000 Cambodian civilians. The campaign was a catastrophic failure in military terms, but it was a staggering success for Pol Pot. The bombs physically and psychologically shattered the Cambodian countryside. Entire villages were obliterated. The survivors, driven mad with fear and rage, fled from the wreckage of their lives directly into the arms of the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot didn't even need to lie. He could simply point to the sky, to the American B-52s, and say, "This is what the city, the West, and their puppets in Phnom Penh bring you. We, Angkar, are the only ones who can restore the honor of the Khmer people." The bombing created a generation of vengeful, traumatized peasants and turned them into a disciplined army. By 1975, with the American-backed government rotting from corruption and defeat, Pol Pot's child soldiers, forged in the fire of prison ideology and American bombs, stood at the gates of the capital, ready to unleash their master's utopian nightmare. With Phnom Penh empty and the country under its absolute control, Angkar began the most radical and violent social experiment in human history. Pol Pot's prison fantasy was about to be unleashed. As a nationwide reality, the order was given. The calendar was to be reset. It was now year zero. Everything that had come before was a disease. The past was to be annihilated. The war on the past began with the symbols of the modern world. The first to go was money. In a grand symbolic gesture, the National Bank of Cambodia was literally blown up, sending millions of now worthless real banknotes fluttering into the empty streets. Money was declared the root of all evil. With no currency, there could be no commerce. With no commerce, there could be no private property. With no private property, there could be no inequality. It was a brutally simple logic. Markets were shut down, their stalls left to rot. A lifetime of savings was now just paper. The new currency was a single can of rice, distributed by Angkar. Next, Angkar declared war on knowledge itself. All schools, from rural primary schools to the universities in Phnom Penh, were closed and converted into barracks, prisons, or manure storage sheds. Hospitals were emptied. The trained doctors and nurses were now new people, enemies of the state, forced into the same labor gangs as everyone else. Medicine, as the world knew it, ceased to exist. In its place, the regime promoted the use of traditional folk remedies and a blind faith in the power of the revolution to heal. A headache was to be treated with coconut juice. A serious infection with the patient's own urine. The National Library was torched. Centuries of Cambodian literature, art, and science vanished in the flames. But Angkar's most intimate and cruel attack was on the family. The family was a competing loyalty. A child who loved their parents more than Angkar was a traitor. So, the family unit was systematically dismantled. Children were taken from their parents and placed in separate youth labor brigades, where they were taught that Angkar was their only true mother and father. A child who reported his parents for hoarding a handful of rice was praised as a hero of the revolution. A child who cried for her mother was beaten for her weakness. Personal relationships were forbidden. Marriages were arranged by the local Angkar chief, often in mass ceremonies where strangers were paired off for reproductive purposes. Communal dining was enforced to prevent private family meals. The very words for mother and father were discouraged. Everyone was to be addressed as brother, sister, or comrade. The goal was to atomize society, to break every human bond until the only connection left was the individual's total. Terrified submission to Angkar, the entire population was organized into a giant, militarized labor camp. Society was split into two rigid castes: the base people, the poor. Rural peasants who had been the original base of the revolution were considered the pure, ideal citizens. And then there were the new people, the 2 million evacuees from the cities. They were the doctors, teachers, lawyers, merchants, students, and their families. By default, they were considered tainted, suspect, the enemy within. They were given the hardest work, the smallest food rations, and were subject to the harshest discipline. Life became a monotonous cycle of grueling labor and political indoctrination. After a 12-hour workday, the exhausted workers were forced to attend re-education meetings, where they would chant slogans and engage in self-criticism, confessing their individualistic thoughts. But as the Utopia failed to rise, as starvation and disease began to ravage the communes, Pol Pot's paranoia intensified. He believed the revolution was failing not because his vision was flawed, but because it was being sabotaged from within by hidden enemies. He needed a place to find these enemies and extract their confessions. In the now empty city of Phnom Penh, his men took over a former high school named Tuol Sleng. They surrounded it with electrified barbed wire, turned the classrooms into tiny brick cells, and transformed the children's playground equipment into horrific instruments of torture. They gave it a new name, Security Prison 21, or Esther 1. It would become the heart of the regime's terror, a place where the revolution would begin to systematically devour its own children. The utopian dream of Year Zero was a catastrophic failure. The great agrarian leap forward had produced not a surplus of rice, but a surplus of skeletons. Starvation and disease were rampant, but in the paranoid mind of Pol Pot and the leadership of Angkar, the failure was not due to their flawed vision. It was sabotage. The revolution, they believed, was infested with worms, with hidden enemies. With the ghosts of the old society, the purification had to escalate. The time for re-education was over. The time for outright slaughter had begun. The logic of the genocide was as simple as it was insane. The new people from the cities were considered enemies by their very nature. But the definition of an enemy expanded to encompass anyone who betrayed a hint of the past world. To wear glasses was a death sentence, as it implied you were an intellectual who read books. To speak a foreign language was proof of foreign contamination. To be a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer, an artist, or even a Buddhist monk was to be an enemy of the peasant revolution. The paranoia became so extreme that people were murdered for complaining about the lack of food, for showing affection to a family member, or for foraging for wild berries without permission. Their guiding philosophy was codified in a chilling slogan: better to kill an innocent by mistake than to spare an enemy by mistake. There were no trials. There was no appeal. Suspicion alone was proof of guilt, and the sentence was always death. For hundreds of thousands, life in the communes was itself a death sentence. The daily ration of food was often just a thin rice soup, boba, sometimes with a few corn kernels. It was starvation by design, a policy of extermination through attrition. The 16-hour workdays, 7 days a week, in the blistering sun or monsoon rains, pushed bodies to their absolute limit. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi swept through the camps, killing indiscriminately. But for those deemed active enemies, the end was more direct. These were the killing fields, all across Cambodia, in orchards, forests, and next to remote caves. The regime established over 300 of these extermination sites. The process was brutally efficient. Prisoners were told they were being transferred to a new work location. They were trucked or marched out at night to these designated fields to save precious and expensive ammunition. The executions were carried out with whatever was available. Victims were forced to kneel at the edge of mass graves. They had often been forced to dig themselves. They were bludgeoned from behind. The soldiers, many of them children, were instructed to be thorough. The fields were often located next to large trees, which were used to blast loud revolutionary music from speakers to drown out the screams of the dying. At the infamous Choon Ek killing field outside Phnom Penh, there stands a killing tree, its bark still scarred. It was against this tree that executioners murdered babies and small children, holding them by the legs and smashing their heads against the trunk, before tossing their bodies into the pits, where their mothers had just been buried. It was the most efficient way to ensure the next generation could never seek revenge. If the killing fields were the body of the genocide, its brain was a converted high school in the heart of the ghost city. This was Security Prison 21, Tuol Sleng, or S21. This was not a prison for common criminals. It was Angkar's central torture chamber, reserved for its own members' party, officials, soldiers, and their families who had fallen under the ever-widening shadow of Pol Pot's paranoia. S21 was run by a former math teacher named Kekyu, known as Comrade Dutch. He was a meticulous, obsessive bureaucrat of pain. He demanded his torturers keep detailed records. Upon arrival, every prisoner was photographed and forced to write a detailed autobiography. Then the torture began. The methods were medieval: waterboarding, electrocution from a car battery, pulling out fingernails, mock executions. The goal was not justice, it was confession. Under unimaginable agony, prisoners would confess to anything. They would admit to being agents for the CIA, the KGB, or the Vietnamese, and crucially, they were forced to name their co-conspirators. A desperate prisoner would name their entire network friends, colleagues, even their own family, just to make the pain stop. These new names would then be arrested. brought to S21, and tortured to produce yet another list of names. It was a self-perpetuating feedback loop of terror, a machine that fed on its own paranoia. Of the estimated 20,000 people who entered S21, only a dozen are known to have survived. Once the confession was signed, the prisoner and their entire family, spouses and children included, to eliminate future revenge, were trucked to the killing fields of Choang Ik. This was the final, insane logic of year zero. A nation committing suicide. A government waging a total war on its own people, murdering them for their education, their memories, their very identity. In the span of just 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, Pol Pot's regime had killed nearly 2 million of its own citizens, almost a quarter of the entire population. It was a perfect machine of death, operating with ruthless efficiency. And as the piles of skulls grew higher, the only question left was how and when it could possibly be stopped. A machine of perfect internal terror, the Khmer Rouge regime made a fatal miscalculation. Drunk on their own paranoid, ultra-nationalist ideology, they began launching increasingly bloody cross-border raids into Vietnam, believing they could reclaim ancient Khmer territories. They had murdered their own doctors, teachers, and engineers. Yet they believed they could defeat one of the most battle-hardened armies on the planet. It was an act of supreme arrogance, and it would be their undoing. On Christmas Day, 1978, Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion. The Khmer Rouge, an army designed to terrorize unarmed peasants, melted away in the face of a conventional military force. The regime that had taken 4 years to build its prison state collapsed in just 2 weeks. On January 7, 1979, the Vietnamese army rolled into Phnom Penh, capturing the ghost city for a second time. The reign of Angkar was over, and only then did the world begin to understand the true depth of the horror. As journalists and international observers followed the Vietnamese army, they uncovered the secrets of year zero. They found Tuol Sleng, S21, a high school converted into a factory of pain. Its floors still stained with blood, its rooms filled with the meticulous photographic records of the thousands who were tortured and murdered there. They found the killing fields, like Choang Ik, where the earth itself, when disturbed by the monsoons, would give up the bones and tattered clothing of the dead. The scale of the genocide was incomprehensible. A nation in ruins, its infrastructure destroyed, its population decimated. Of the country's 700 doctors, only 40 remained alive. Of its 20,000 teachers, only 2,000 survived. The survivors, skeletal and traumatized, began a long, slow journey back to their empty homes, a day of anger erupting as the raw grief of a nation was finally unleashed. But their nightmare was not truly over. In one of the most cynical betrayals of the Cold War, the world turned its back on them because the new Cambodian government was backed by Vietnam, and by extension the Soviet Union, the United States, China, and Great Britain refused to recognize it. Instead, they insisted that the official, legitimate representative of Cambodia at the United Nations remain the Khmer Rouge. The world held its nose and, for more than a decade, politically and financially propped up the genocidal regime, allowing Pol Pot and his henchmen to wage a guerrilla war from the jungles of the Thai border. Justice, when it came, was agonizingly slow and incomplete. Pol Pot himself was never brought before a court. He died in 1998, officially of heart failure, while under house arrest by his own former comrades, taking his secrets to the grave. It wasn't until the 21st century that a UN-backed tribunal finally brought a handful of senior leaders, like the S-21 Commandant, Comrade Dutch, to justice. But for most survivors, it was too little, too late. Today, Cambodia is a nation that has rebuilt itself from the ashes, but the ghosts remain. It is a country where former low-level Khmer Rouge cadres live in the same villages as the families of the people they murdered. It is a nation where an entire generation was raised in the shadow of unspeakable trauma. The final horrifying legacy of Year Zero is not just in the fields of skulls, but in the silence between neighbors, in the memories of the survivors, and in the profound question of how a modern country could, with such speed and brutality, decide to murder its own past. Pol Pot's revolution, a dream of pure agrarian simplicity conceived in the cafes of Paris, did not create a utopia. It created a void, a haunting testament to the terrifying power of a single, monstrous idea. If you find these hidden histories as fascinating as we do, be sure to subscribe to the Black Chronicle channel so you don't miss any future episodes. And don't forget to hit the notification bell to always be the first to uncover the deepest mysteries. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.